Welcome to the Silent Empires, where the stories are calm, the atmosphere is dark, and every word is meant to pull you deeper into the night. This channel is for the listeners who enjoy quiet voices, slow moments, and the feeling of drifting through stories while the world around them sleeps. No interruptions, no noise, just uninterrupted storytelling from beginning to end. If this story made your night a little more interesting, take a moment to leave a like. And in the comments, tell me something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It's always incredible seeing people from different cities and different countries, all connected here together through the same story. As the 1940s gave way to the post-war era, New York City entered a period of outward prosperity that masked a quieter consolidation of power beneath the surface. Factories that had once produced wartime supplies shifted back to civilian goods. Returning veterans filled apartments and storefronts. Highways expanded, suburbs grew, and the skyline continued its steady climb. Yet within the boroughs, particularly in Manhattan and the Bronx, long-established criminal networks were refining their structures, becoming more disciplined and more strategic than the street gangs of earlier decades. It was during this time that Salvatore D'Ambrosio moved from the periphery of organized crime toward a more defined and consequential role. By the late 1940s, the organization that would come to be widely known as the Genovese crime family had already undergone significant transformation. Under the influence of figures like Charles, Lucky, Luciano, and later Vito Genovese, the loose coalitions of Prohibition-era bootleggers had evolved into coordinated entities with clear hierarchies. Authority flowed downward from the boss to the underboss, through capworgimes who oversaw crews of soldiers and associates. Decisions were not impulsive, they were calculated. Revenue streams were diversified. Internal discipline was strict. For men like D'Ambrosio, advancement required patience and restraint. The culture of the organization valued discretion above spectacle. Public flamboyance, once common during Prohibition, had proven dangerous in an era of increasing federal oversight. The memory of national investigations in the early 1950s, particularly the televised hearings that exposed organized crime's structure to a wide audience, served as a cautionary tale. Those who drew unnecessary attention risked jeopardizing not only themselves, but the broader enterprise. D'Ambrosio's rise appears to have been rooted in reliability rather than notoriety. Unlike some figures whose reputations were built on headline-grabbing confrontations, he developed a profile consistent with the Genovese family's preference for quiet influence. By the 1950s, he was associated with operations in East Harlem and the Bronx, areas where gambling, loan activities, and labor-related enterprises generated steady income. These activities, while illegal, were typically conducted in ways designed to minimize public disruption. The organization depended on predictability. Sudden disturbances invited scrutiny. The social landscape of Italian-American neighborhoods during this period remained complex. Many families were achieving upward mobility, moving into more spacious housing and entering professional trades. At the same time, long-standing informal systems of neighborhood authority persisted. In some communities, organized crime figures maintained reputations as intermediaries, individuals who could resolve disputes, extend credit, or influence business decisions. This dual identity, both feared and respected, allowed certain members to embed themselves deeply within local economies. As D'Ambrosio's standing grew, so too did the importance of maintaining internal alliances. The Genovese family, like other New York families, operated within a broader commission structure that coordinated activities among rival groups. Stability depended on negotiation as much as force. Internal conflicts were addressed carefully, often through mediated discussion rather than public confrontation. For someone seeking longevity, understanding these dynamics was essential. The late 1950s marked a pivotal chapter in the history of organized crime in New York. In 1957, A gathering of prominent mob figures in Appalachian, New York, was disrupted by law enforcement, drawing national attention and reinforcing federal commitment to dismantling organized networks. Although public records do not prominently feature D'Ambrosio in connection with that specific event, its impact reverberated across all families. Increased surveillance, expanded investigative tools, and a more coordinated prosecutorial strategy reshaped the environment in which he operated. In response, the Genovese family adopted an even more guarded posture. Meetings became more discreet. Communication methods were adjusted. Leadership emphasized insulation, ensuring that those at higher levels were shielded from direct involvement in day-to-day operations that could expose them legally. For rising figures like D'Ambrosio, this meant mastering a delicate balance, remaining effective in generating revenue and managing relationships, while avoiding direct ties to activities that might lead to indictment. The 1960s brought additional shifts. Federal legislation, particularly the development and eventual application of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act (RICO) in 1970, would later transform prosecutorial strategy. But even before RICO's passage, law enforcement agencies were refining techniques for building conspiracy cases. Surveillance technology improved. Informants became more central to investigations. Grand juries expanded their reach. Within this tightening environment, D'Ambrosio's reputation continued to solidify. He was viewed not as a volatile enforcer, but as a steady participant in the family's economic operations. The Genovese organization had long been involved in labor racketeering, exerting influence over unions and construction contracts. Control over such sectors provided leverage far beyond street-level enterprises. It allowed the family to shape major development projects and maintain a presence in legitimate industries. New York City in the 1960s and early 1970s underwent dramatic change. Urban unrest, fiscal strain, and demographic shifts altered neighborhoods that had once been dominated by tight-knit immigrant enclaves. Italian Harlem itself began to change as residents moved outward and new communities settled in. For established organized crime figures, these transitions required adaptation. Influence rooted solely in ethnicity was no longer sufficient. Alliances had to extend across evolving social boundaries. D'Ambrosio navigated this period with the caution that had characterized his earlier years. While some contemporaries became entangled in highly publicized trials, his name surfaced less frequently in headlines. This relative invisibility did not imply inactivity. On the contrary, within organized structures, longevity often signaled effectiveness. Those who remained active over decades without attracting sustained prosecution were typically those who understood the value of restraint. At the same time, internal dynamics within the Genovese family were shifting. Leadership transitions, periods of incarceration for high-ranking members, and the need to maintain continuity created opportunities for seasoned figures to assume greater responsibility. By the 1970s, D'Ambrosio was regarded as an established member of the organization, operating within a framework that demanded both loyalty and strategic thinking. The broader American public, increasingly aware of organized crime through media coverage and popular culture, often viewed mob figures through a lens of dramatization. Films and books portrayed them as larger-than-life characters, yet the day-to-day reality was more procedural. Meetings, negotiations, financial calculations, and careful communication defined the routine. For D'Ambrosio, success depended not on cinematic bravado but on adherence to organizational codes. The passage of RICO in 1970 would soon alter the stakes significantly. By allowing prosecutors to target entire criminal enterprises rather than isolated acts, the law threatened the insulation that families had relied upon. Patterns of activity could now form the basis of sweeping indictments. For figures who had spent decades cultivating distance from direct involvement, This presented a new and formidable challenge. As the 1970s progressed, federal investigations into New York's organized crime families intensified. Informants, some motivated by reduced sentences, others by personal grievances, began providing authorities with unprecedented insight into internal structures. The era of near-total secrecy was eroding. Long-standing assumptions about loyalty were tested as cooperation with law enforcement became a more common prosecutorial tool. Salvatore D'Ambrosio entered this period as a veteran of the underworld, shaped by Depression-era scarcity, post-war consolidation, and years of disciplined operation. He had witnessed the transformation of organized crime from loosely connected neighborhood groups into structured enterprises navigating national scrutiny. The lessons of his youth, caution, patience, allegiance, remained central to his approach. Yet the environment was changing in ways that even seasoned figures could not fully control. The strategies that had ensured survival in the 1950s were no longer sufficient against the expanding reach of federal law. The quiet consolidation that had marked his rise would soon be tested by investigations aimed at dismantling the very framework that had sustained his career. By the end of the 1970s, the stage was set for confrontations that would define not only the future of the Genovese family, but also D'Ambrosio's own legacy. The boy who had grown up in the crowded streets of Italian Harlem had become a durable presence within one of America's most enduring criminal organizations. The next chapter of his life would unfold under a level of scrutiny unlike anything he had previously faced. By the dawn of the 1980s, the atmosphere surrounding organized crime in New York had shifted from cautious surveillance to direct confrontation. Federal prosecutors, armed with years of intelligence and empowered by the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, were no longer content to pursue isolated charges. Their aim was structural, to demonstrate that the mafia families of New York operated as ongoing criminal enterprises and to hold their leadership accountable for patterns of coordinated activity. Courtrooms, rather than street corners, were becoming the primary battleground. For Salvatore D'Ambrosio, who had spent decades cultivating discretion within the Genovese crime family, this new era posed the most serious challenge of his career. The Genovese family had long been regarded by investigators as one of the most disciplined and insulated of New York's five families. Its leadership structure emphasized buffers, layers of authority designed to distance top figures from day-to-day operations. Orders were often relayed indirectly. Meetings were carefully arranged. Public visibility was minimized. D'Ambrosio's own reputation aligned with this culture of caution. He was known within law enforcement circles as a seasoned participant in the family's affairs, particularly in areas tied to gambling and labor-related enterprises. But he did not project the flamboyance that had drawn media attention to other crime figures. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, federal investigations increasingly focused on labor racketeering, especially in industries where organized crime influence could translate into substantial revenue. Construction, trucking, and waterfront activities were of particular interest. By exerting influence over unions or contractors, criminal organizations could shape bidding processes, secure steady streams of income, and reinforce their authority. Prosecutors sought to document these arrangements in detail, piecing together financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from cooperating witnesses. D'Ambrosio's name began appearing more frequently in investigative files during this period. Authorities viewed him as a reliable member of the Genovese organization, someone entrusted with responsibilities that required discretion. The government's strategy was not simply to prove individual wrongdoing, but to demonstrate patterns, evidence that could illustrate how various actors functioned within a coordinated enterprise. Surveillance operations expanded. Wiretaps, authorized by court order, captured conversations that investigators analyzed meticulously for indications of hierarchy and intent. The early 1980s were marked by a series of high-profile prosecutions targeting mafia leadership across New York. These cases signaled a broader commitment by federal authorities to dismantle entrenched criminal structures. The message was clear: long-standing reputations and decades of insulation would no longer guarantee safety from indictment. For established figures like D'Ambrosio, the cumulative effect of these prosecutions was unmistakable. The environment had become one of sustained legal pressure. In 1985, this pressure culminated in what became known as the Commission case, a sweeping federal indictment that targeted the leadership of several New York crime families. The case alleged that the Commission, the body through which family bosses coordinated activities, functioned as a governing entity overseeing a range of racketeering acts. While Salvatore D'Ambrosio was not counted among the most publicly recognized defendants in that trial, the investigation's scope encompassed members and associates connected to the Genovese family's operations. The proceedings underscored the vulnerability of even the most insulated networks. The courtroom drama of the mid-1980s captured national attention. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence, including testimony from former insiders who described the inner workings of the families. For the first time, the public heard detailed explanations of hierarchical structures, initiation ceremonies, and the mechanisms of control that had long been shielded from view. Although much of this testimony centered on senior leadership, its implications extended to all established members, D'Ambrosio included. The insulation that had defined the Genovese approach was being methodically penetrated. As convictions were secured against prominent leaders, power dynamics within the families shifted. Some figures faced lengthy prison sentences. Others assumed acting roles to maintain continuity. For veteran members who remained outside prison walls, adaptability was essential. They had to navigate a landscape where communication was riskier, trust more fragile, and the prospect of informants ever present. The era of unwavering silence, the code often associated with organized crime, was increasingly tested by the realities of federal sentencing guidelines. During this time, D'Ambrosio's standing within the Genovese family reflected both experience and survival. Decades of involvement had positioned him as a steady presence amid upheaval. Law enforcement assessments described him as part of the family's established structure, someone whose longevity signaled deep integration. Yet that very longevity also meant he was well known to investigators. The balance between influence and exposure grew more precarious with each passing year. The late 1980s also saw the continued evolution of prosecutorial tactics. Authorities leveraged financial investigations to trace illicit proceeds, examining bank records and property holdings. The aim was not only to secure convictions, but to disrupt economic foundations. Asset forfeiture became a powerful tool. Organized crime figures who had once relied on cash-based operations found themselves facing increasingly sophisticated scrutiny. New York City itself was undergoing transformation. The fiscal crises of the 1970s had given way to gradual recovery. Redevelopment projects reshaped neighborhoods, and new political leadership emphasized law enforcement initiatives. Public tolerance for organized crime's influence diminished as awareness grew. Media coverage, no longer romanticized, often framed mafia figures as relics of a fading era confronting an assertive justice system. For Salvatore D'Ambrosio, the cumulative weight of investigations, indictments, and shifting public sentiment marked a turning point. The protective layers that had characterized his ascent were thinning. Associates who had once operated with confidence now faced the prospect of cooperation agreements. Meetings that had once seemed routine carried heightened risk. Every interaction had to be measured against the possibility of surveillance. Yet even amid these pressures, the Genovese family retained a reputation for discipline. Compared to some rival groups that experienced internal turmoil and high-profile defections, the Genovese organization maintained a comparatively low public profile. This culture of caution, instilled over decades, offered a measure of resilience. D'Ambrosio's career had been built within that framework, and its principles continued to guide his actions. By the close of the 1980s, the confrontation between organized crime and federal authorities had entered a sustained phase. The myth of invulnerability surrounding long-standing mafia figures had been decisively challenged. Courtrooms had replaced street displays of power as the defining arenas of conflict. For D'Ambrosio, who had matured from a young associate in Italian Harlem to a seasoned member of a powerful criminal enterprise, the stakes were now unmistakably personal. The strategies that once ensured quiet advancement, loyalty, restraint, careful communication, were being tested against a justice system determined to document every layer of the organization. As the new decade approached, Salvatore D'Ambrosio stood at a crossroads shaped by history, a veteran of an older underworld confronting a legal landscape designed to dismantle it. The next chapter of his life would unfold under the shadow of indictments and trials that sought not merely to punish individuals, but to redefine the balance of power between organized crime and the state. The 1990s opened with a sense that the long campaign against New York's organized crime families was entering its most decisive stage. Years of investigation had matured into a steady rhythm of indictments, plea agreements, and trials. Federal prosecutors, drawing on RICO statutes and the testimony of cooperating witnesses, aimed not only to punish individual acts, but to map entire chains of authority. The courtroom had become a forum where decades of secrecy were unpacked in painstaking detail. For Salvatore D'Ambrosio, now an aging but still significant figure within the Genovese crime family, this period would prove to be the most legally perilous of his life. By this time, D'Ambrosio had spent decades embedded in a disciplined organization known for avoiding public spectacle. The Genovese family, often described by investigators as the most cautious of the five families, prided itself on internal order and insulation. Leadership roles were structured to shield senior members from direct exposure. Yet the expanding reach of federal investigations made even indirect involvement a potential liability. The government's strategy increasingly relied on demonstrating patterns, showing how individual actions fit into a coordinated enterprise. Throughout the early 1990s, authorities intensified their focus on labor racketeering and construction-related activities in New York City. Major public works projects and private developments represented enormous financial stakes. Prosecutors alleged that certain organized crime figures exerted influence over bidding processes, labor assignments, and subcontracting arrangements. These allegations were built through years of surveillance, financial analysis, and testimony from insiders who had chosen to cooperate. D'Ambrosio's name surfaced in connection with investigations examining the Genovese family's role in construction and related industries. Law enforcement agencies viewed him as part of a network that operated behind the scenes, relying on established relationships rather than overt displays of power. His reputation for discretion, once an asset, now complicated his defense. Prosecutors argued that the very absence of publicity reflected calculated restraint rather than innocence. In 1992, federal authorities brought forward significant indictments against members and associates of the Genovese family, targeting what they described as systematic control over segments of the construction industry. The charges were framed within the RICO statute, allowing the government to present a broad narrative of enterprise activity rather than isolated incidents. Court filings laid out alleged patterns of extortion, bid manipulation, and other racketeering acts. While legal proceedings focused on evidence and due process, the broader implication was unmistakable. The insulation strategy that had defined the Genovese organization was being directly challenged. The courtroom environment during these trials was markedly different from the secretive meetings of earlier decades. Proceedings were methodical and public. Prosecutors introduced recorded conversations obtained through court-authorized wiretaps. Financial documents were projected for juries to examine line by line. Witnesses described organizational hierarchies and explained how orders were conveyed indirectly to avoid detection. Defense attorneys countered by questioning credibility, context, and interpretation, emphasizing the presumption of innocence that anchors the American legal system. For D'Ambrosio, these years were defined less by street-level maneuvering and more by legal strategy. The careful navigation that had characterized his earlier career now took the form of consultations with attorneys and measured courtroom appearances. Observers noted that he maintained a composed demeanor, consistent with the understated approach long associated with his name. Yet beneath that composure lay the reality that federal sentencing guidelines, strengthened in previous decades, carried the possibility of substantial prison terms if convictions were secured. The early 1990s also marked a broader cultural shift. Public perception of organized crime had changed dramatically from the mid-20th century. Romanticized portrayals in popular media coexisted with a growing awareness of the economic and social consequences of racketeering. Civic leaders and reform advocates argued that entrenched criminal influence distorted markets and undermined fair competition. In this climate, juries were often attentive to detailed financial evidence and institutional patterns. As trials progressed, some defendants chose to enter plea agreements, weighing the certainty of negotiated sentences against the unpredictability of jury verdicts. Cooperation by insiders continued to reshape the legal landscape. Testimony from former participants offered jurors insight into coded language, internal rules, and the methods by which authority was exercised without written directives. Such testimony did not go unchallenged, but it added layers of narrative that prosecutors used to support enterprise-level charges. D'Ambrosio's legal battles unfolded against this backdrop of sustained scrutiny. Court records from the period reflect the complexity of RICO prosecutions, where defense teams sought to isolate individual conduct from the broader enterprise allegations advanced by the government. The prosecution's burden was substantial, to prove not merely association, but participation in a pattern of racketeering activity tied to an ongoing organization. In 1994 and 1995, additional cases further underscored the government's commitment to dismantling organized crime's foothold in construction and labor sectors. Even as some high-ranking figures from earlier eras remained incarcerated, new indictments targeted those believed to have stepped into operational roles. The generational continuity that had once ensured stability now provided prosecutors with a narrative of persistence, an argument that the enterprise endured despite prior convictions. For D'Ambrosio, advancing age did not insulate him from accountability. Federal courts showed little inclination to exempt long-standing figures based on seniority. Sentencing considerations weighed factors such as role, duration of involvement, and the scope of alleged activities. The disciplined persona that had shielded him from sensational headlines could not shield him from the evidentiary standards of federal court. Throughout these proceedings, the Genovese family's defining trait, caution, remained visible. Unlike rival organizations that experienced public internal conflicts during the same era, the Genovese group maintained relative quiet. Analysts often attributed this to its entrenched culture of insulation and indirect communication. D'Ambrosio, shaped by decades within that culture, exemplified its ethos even as it faced unprecedented legal strain. By the mid-1990s, the cumulative effect of sustained prosecutions had altered the balance of power between organized crime and law enforcement. The once formidable aura surrounding mafia leadership had diminished under the steady weight of convictions and lengthy sentences. For figures like Salvatore D'Ambrosio, the struggle was no longer about expanding influence. It was about preserving freedom and navigating a justice system equipped with expansive investigative tools. As the decade progressed, the legal outcomes of these cases would define D'Ambrosio's remaining years. The boy from Italian Harlem, who had risen quietly through a disciplined criminal hierarchy, now confronted the institutional resolve of the federal government. The era that had shaped his ascent, marked by secrecy and insulation, had given way to one defined by documentation and disclosure. The next phase of his life would hinge not on coded conversations in back rooms, but on verdicts rendered in open court. As the mid-1990s unfolded, the legal pressure that had been building for years reached a defining stage in Salvatore D'Ambrosio's life. Federal prosecutors, having invested extensive resources into dismantling entrenched racketeering networks, pursued cases with a level of preparation that reflected decades of accumulated experience. Courtrooms in New York became arenas where not only individual actions but entire organizational histories were examined. For D'Ambrosio, now a senior figure shaped by more than half a century within the Genovese crime family's orbit, the consequences of that scrutiny were no longer abstract. The trials connected to construction and labor racketeering revealed the government's determination to illustrate how organized crime's influence extended into legitimate industries. Prosecutors presented evidence intended to demonstrate coordinated efforts to influence contracts, manage competition, and generate illicit income streams. These cases did not rely on dramatic moments. They relied on documentation, financial records, recorded conversations, and the testimony of individuals who described how authority was exercised indirectly. The strategy was cumulative, building a picture of continuity rather than focusing on a single event. D'Ambrosio's role, as characterized by investigators, reflected the Genovese family's long-standing preference for insulation. He was portrayed not as a public spokesman or headline-seeking leader, but as a steady participant in the structure that sustained the enterprise. Defense attorneys countered that association did not equate to criminal responsibility, emphasizing the legal principle that guilt must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The proceedings were measured, technical, and often complex, reflecting the layered nature of RICO prosecutions. In 1996, after years of investigation and trial preparation, significant convictions were secured against members of the Genovese family in cases tied to racketeering in the construction industry. Salvatore D'Ambrosio was among those found guilty in federal court. The verdict marked a turning point. For a man who had navigated decades of scrutiny without facing such a decisive outcome, the conviction underscored how thoroughly the legal landscape had shifted since his early years in Italian Harlem. Sentencing hearings that followed reflected the seriousness with which federal courts viewed enterprise-level racketeering. Judges considered the scope and duration of the activities presented during trial, as well as the broader objective of deterring similar conduct. D'Ambrosio received a substantial prison sentence, one that effectively closed the chapter on his active participation within the Genovese family's operations. The disciplined caution that had defined his rise could not insulate him from the reach of federal statutes designed precisely to address long-term patterns of organized criminal activity. Imprisonment marked a profound transition. For figures accustomed to influence exercised through networks of loyalty and hierarchy, the structured routine of federal custody represented a stark contrast. The routines of prison life, regulated schedules, restricted communication, and constant oversight, stood in sharp opposition to the autonomy that had characterized D'Ambrosio's earlier decades. Yet even in confinement, reputations forged over time did not vanish entirely. Within correctional facilities, long-standing figures often carried a quiet recognition rooted in shared history. The late 1990s were a period of reflection, not only for D'Ambrosio personally, but for the broader narrative of organized crime in New York. By that point, many of the most prominent leaders of earlier generations were incarcerated. The commission case and subsequent prosecutions had fractured long-standing chains of authority. While organized crime did not disappear, its public visibility and institutional reach were diminished. Analysts and law enforcement officials frequently cited the Genovese family's earlier insulation strategies as having delayed, but not prevented, the impact of RICO-based prosecutions. Outside prison walls, New York City was undergoing dramatic change. Crime rates declined significantly during the 1990s, driven by a combination of policing strategies, demographic shifts, and economic factors. Major construction projects continued across the city, but the environment in which contracts were negotiated had been reshaped by oversight and reform initiatives. The industries that had once provided steady revenue streams for organized crime were subject to increased monitoring. The space for entrenched racketeering narrowed. For D'Ambrosio, these societal changes unfolded at a distance. His life, once defined by strategic conversations and carefully maintained alliances, was now circumscribed by institutional boundaries. Legal appeals were pursued through established channels, reflecting the procedural avenues available to any federal defendant. Such appeals examined questions of evidence and interpretation rather than relitigating entire narratives. The judicial system's layered review process underscored its emphasis on structure and precedent. As years passed, age became an increasingly significant factor. D'Ambrosio had been born in 1911. By the time of his conviction in the mid-1990s, he was well into his 80s. The arc of his life spanned extraordinary transformations in American society, from the immigrant tenements of pre-World War New York to the technologically advanced, surveillance-equipped justice system of the late 20th century. Few individuals experienced such a dramatic evolution in the balance between organized crime and federal authority so directly. In the public record, descriptions of D'Ambrosio during these later years remained consistent with his long-standing image, measured, restrained, and largely removed from spectacle. Unlike some contemporaries whose stories were amplified through media appearances or memoirs, he maintained the quiet profile that had characterized his ascent. His legacy, as interpreted by historians and law enforcement analysts, centered on longevity within one of the most disciplined of New York's crime families. The broader implications of his conviction were symbolic as well as practical. It demonstrated that even deeply insulated organizations were vulnerable to sustained investigative effort. The RICO statute, once an untested legal instrument, had proven capable of reaching across decades of activity. For communities long affected by racketeering practices, these outcomes represented a recalibration of power. Yet the story of Salvatore D'Ambrosio was not solely about prosecution and punishment. It was also about the environment that shaped him, the immigrant neighborhoods of early 20th century Manhattan, the economic hardships of the Great Depression, and the cultural codes that governed loyalty and advancement within organized crime. His trajectory reflected the interplay between opportunity and exclusion, discipline and secrecy, adaptation and eventual accountability. As the 1990s drew to a close, D'Ambrosio's remaining years were defined less by influence and more by the enduring consequences of choices made across a lifetime. The federal conviction that had curtailed his freedom stood as a culmination of decades of legal evolution. The justice system he confronted in his 80s was far removed from the fragmented enforcement landscape of his youth. In the end, Part 5 of his life was marked by a reversal of fortune. The steady rise through a hidden hierarchy gave way to public judgment in a federal courtroom. The disciplined restraint that once ensured survival could not prevent the final reckoning delivered by a system determined to dismantle the structures he had served for so long. The years following Salvatore D'Ambrosio's conviction unfolded in quiet contrast to the decades that had preceded them. Where once his life had revolved around coded conversations, carefully arranged meetings, and the management of influence within the Genovese crime family. It was now defined by the routines and restrictions of federal incarceration. For a man whose adulthood had spanned the rise, consolidation, and eventual prosecution of organized crime in 20th century New York, this period represented not only personal consequence but historical closure. By the late 1990s, D'Ambrosio was in advanced age. His imprisonment underscored one of the defining characteristics of the federal campaign against organized crime. It was patient. Investigations had stretched across years, even decades, building cases that would ultimately reach defendants regardless of their seniority. In earlier eras, age or status might have shielded certain figures from accountability. Under RICO and strengthened sentencing guidelines, that shield no longer existed. Inside federal custody, life was structured and predictable. Days were regulated by institutional schedules, meals, counts, limited recreation, and controlled communication. For long-time organized crime figures, this environment was a stark departure from the autonomy they once exercised. Yet federal facilities housing elderly inmates often presented a subdued atmosphere compared to the turmoil sometimes associated with earlier decades of prison life. Many incarcerated mob figures during this period were elderly, serving sentences imposed late in their lives as a result of sweeping racketeering cases. D'Ambrosio's health inevitably became a factor. Born in 1911, he had lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the rise and fall of Prohibition, and the transformation of American law enforcement. By the time of his incarceration, he was in his 80s. The Bureau of Prisons, like all correctional systems, faced the practical realities of housing aging inmates with medical needs. For individuals convicted under enterprise-level statutes, compassionate release or sentence modifications were occasionally considered, though such measures were subject to strict legal standards and judicial discretion. While D'Ambrosio served his sentence, the Genovese crime family continued to adapt to a changing world. The organization's hallmark had always been discretion, and in the wake of the major prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s, that culture deepened. Leadership structures were adjusted to reduce exposure. Communication became more guarded. Law enforcement agencies, however, had grown equally adept, employing electronic surveillance, financial tracking, and informant testimony with increasing sophistication. The broader landscape of organized crime at the turn of the millennium bore little resemblance to the one D'Ambrosio had entered as a young man. The street corner operations of the Prohibition era had given way to more complex financial schemes in later decades, and by the 2000s, technological change introduced new challenges and vulnerabilities. Electronic records created trails that were harder to erase. Globalization altered markets and introduced new criminal enterprises beyond the traditional spheres of gambling and labor influence. The insular, neighborhood-based model that shaped D'Ambrosio's early years was gradually giving way to more diffuse networks. Public perception had also shifted decisively. By the early 21st century, organized crime was no longer viewed through the lens of mystique that had once surrounded it. Extensive prosecutions and media coverage had reframed the narrative. Rather than symbols of power operating beyond the law, aging mafia figures were increasingly seen as remnants of a fading era. Court convictions and lengthy sentences reinforced the message that even the most entrenched organizations were subject to accountability. For D'Ambrosio personally, these societal changes unfolded at a remove. His later years were marked by the physical limitations of age and the legal reality of confinement. Appeals and post-conviction motions, common in federal cases, moved through the courts according to established procedures. Such filings reflected the legal avenues available to any defendant, underscoring the structured nature of the justice system he had once worked so carefully to avoid. In examining this period, it becomes clear that D'Ambrosio's story mirrors a broader generational arc. The men who had matured during Prohibition and the Depression were, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, reaching the end of their lives. Many had faced prosecution only after decades of insulated operation. The federal government's persistence ensured that time alone would not erase responsibility. For historians and criminologists, this era represented the culmination of a long institutional effort to dismantle hierarchical crime families. Salvatore D'Ambrosio died in 2002. His passing closed a chapter that began in the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of early 20th century Manhattan. He had lived to see the transformation of the organization he served, from a loosely structured network navigating the uncertainties of Prohibition to a disciplined family confronting sustained federal prosecution. His death occurred not in the sphere of influence he once inhabited, but in the shadow of a conviction that defined his final years. News of his death did not produce the dramatic headlines that once accompanied major organized crime figures. By 2002, the cycle of indictments and convictions had become a familiar feature of the legal landscape. The era of larger-than-life mob bosses dominating front pages had largely passed. Instead, D'Ambrosio's story settled into the historical record as part of a broader narrative about the rise and decline of traditional mafia power in New York. Yet his life remains instructive. It illustrates how environment and opportunity can intersect with personal choice to shape a decades-long trajectory. Born into an immigrant community navigating economic hardship and social marginalization, he gravitated toward a structure that offered belonging, stability, and advancement, albeit outside the law. For years, that structure appeared durable, even untouchable. Ultimately, however, it proved vulnerable to systematic legal challenge. The closing years of D'Ambrosio's life reflect the enduring tension between secrecy and transparency, between parallel systems of authority and the formal institutions of the state. His generation of organized crime figures relied on insulation, hierarchy, and loyalty to sustain influence. The justice system responded with statutes designed to penetrate those layers and hold individuals accountable for collective enterprise. By the time of his death, the balance of power had shifted decisively. Organized crime persisted in various forms, but the centralized dominance once exercised by the five families had been curtailed. The Genovese family, known for its discipline, remained active yet far less visible. The world that had shaped D'Ambrosio's ascent, defined by tenement streets, neighborhood codes, and the shadow economy of Prohibition, had receded into history. Part 6 of his story, then, is one of conclusion rather than expansion. It is the account of an aging figure confronting the legal consequences of a lifetime spent within a hidden hierarchy. His death in 2002 did not erase the decades that preceded it, nor did it restore the influence he once held. Instead, it marked the end of a life that had traced the full arc of 20th century organized crime in New York, from its formative struggles to its eventual reckoning in federal court. In the years after Salvatore D'Ambrosio's death in 2002, the story of his life settled into the broader historical narrative of organized crime in America. Unlike some mafia figures whose names became embedded in popular culture, D'Ambrosio remained a comparatively understated presence in public memory. Yet among historians, criminologists, and law enforcement analysts, his trajectory offered a revealing case study. A man who rose quietly through one of New York's most disciplined crime families, survived decades of scrutiny, and ultimately faced conviction in an era when the justice system had evolved to dismantle the very structures that sustained him. To understand his legacy, it is necessary to view it against the full sweep of the 20th century. D'Ambrosio was born in 1911, at a time when immigrant communities were forging new identities in American cities. Italian Harlem, where he grew up, was a place of tight social bonds and limited economic mobility. Informal power structures flourished in neighborhoods where language barriers and discrimination often distanced residents from mainstream institutions. For young men navigating those conditions, Organized crime networks sometimes presented themselves as systems of opportunity, offering financial stability and a sense of belonging. By the time D'Ambrosio reached adulthood, prohibition had reshaped the underworld into a structured enterprise. The mafia families of New York moved beyond fragmented gangs, forming coordinated hierarchies that mirrored legitimate corporations in their division of authority. The Genovese crime family, with which D'Ambrosio became associated, developed a reputation for caution and strategic insulation. Unlike more flamboyant organizations, it preferred to operate with minimal public display, emphasizing discipline and indirect communication. D'Ambrosio's rise within that environment reflected these values. He was not known for theatrical displays or public declarations. Instead, his advancement appeared rooted in reliability and discretion. Over the decades, as the Genovese family maintained influence in gambling, labor-related enterprises, and construction, D'Ambrosio became part of a generation that believed careful insulation could outlast investigative pressure. For many years, that belief seemed justified. Early law enforcement efforts against organized crime were fragmented, constrained by limited coordination and legal tools. Even when high-profile hearings exposed elements of mafia structure in the 1950s, prosecutions often targeted individuals rather than enterprises. The hierarchical design of families like the Genovese group shielded senior figures from direct implication. Layers of authority acted as buffers, complicating efforts to assign responsibility. However, the passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act in 1970 marked a decisive shift. Over time, RICO enabled prosecutors to frame organized crime as an ongoing enterprise rather than a series of isolated acts. This conceptual shift would eventually define D'Ambrosio's final chapter. By the 1980s and 1990s, federal authorities had refined their strategies, using wiretaps, financial analysis, and cooperating witnesses to build comprehensive cases. His conviction in 1996 symbolized more than personal downfall. It represented the culmination of a generational confrontation between entrenched criminal hierarchies and an evolving justice system. D'Ambrosio, who had come of age in a period when organized crime thrived amid limited oversight, faced sentencing in a legal climate characterized by mandatory guidelines and enterprise-level accountability. The insulation that once defined the Genovese approach proved insufficient against sustained, methodical prosecution. In the years following his death, scholars examining the decline of traditional mafia dominance often pointed to cases like his as evidence of systemic change. The Genovese family did not disappear. Indeed, it remained one of the more stable New York families into the 21st century. But its operations were more constrained, its leadership more cautious, and its public visibility markedly reduced. The era when crime bosses wielded overt influence over major city industries had largely passed. Public perception of organized crime also evolved. By the early 2000s, narratives that once romanticized mafia figures were increasingly counterbalanced by detailed accounts of economic harm and institutional corruption. Investigative journalism and academic research highlighted how racketeering distorted markets, burdened legitimate businesses, and undermined public trust. Within that reframed narrative, D'Ambrosio appeared less as a mythic underworld character and more as a participant in a system that thrived on secrecy and leverage. Yet his life also invites reflection on the broader social currents that shaped his choices. The immigrant neighborhoods of early 20th century New York were marked by resilience as well as hardship. Many families who shared D'Ambrosio's origins pursued paths of education, entrepreneurship, and civic leadership. His trajectory was one of several possible outcomes within a complex social environment. Understanding that context does not excuse unlawful conduct, but it does illuminate the interplay between circumstance and decision. Law enforcement professionals who studied the Genovese family frequently cited its culture of patience as both strength and vulnerability. Patience allowed it to avoid some of the internal conflicts that destabilized rival groups. At the same time, that same culture fostered long-term patterns of activity that, once documented, provided prosecutors with extensive evidence. D'Ambrosio's decades-long presence within the organization ultimately became part of the narrative used to demonstrate continuity and enterprise. In death, as in life, he remained a relatively quiet figure. There were no dramatic public statements, no memoirs offering insider revelations. His story survives primarily in court records, investigative accounts, and the broader chronicle of organized crime's rise and retrenchment in New York. For historians, such figures are essential not because they dominated headlines, but because they represent the structural backbone of organizations that endured for generations. Part 7 of his life story is therefore one of assessment. It asks what his journey reveals about the American century he inhabited. It highlights the transformation of law enforcement from reactive policing to coordinated enterprise prosecution. It underscores the diminishing tolerance for criminal influence within legitimate industries. And it illustrates how even the most disciplined criminal networks can be reshaped by persistent institutional pressure. Salvatore D'Ambrosio's legacy is inseparable from the era that produced him. He was a product of immigrant ambition and urban hardship, of prohibition's unintended consequences, and of a subculture that valued loyalty and silence. He was also a witness to, and participant in, the gradual erosion of that subculture's dominance. His conviction and death marked not just the end of an individual life, but the closing of a chapter in the history of New York's organized crime families. As the 21st century advanced, the five families continued to exist in diminished form, adapting to new realities. But the world that shaped D'Ambrosio's ascent, where influence could be quietly consolidated over decades with limited interference, had irrevocably changed. His life, when viewed in full, stands as a bridge between those two eras. From the crowded tenements of 1911 to the federal courtrooms of the 1990s, and finally to a legacy defined less by power than by the enduring reach of the law. The final measure of Salvatore D'Ambrosio's life lies not only in the record of his conviction or the chronology of his rise within the Genovese crime family, but in what his story reveals about power, adaptation, and consequence across nearly a century of American history. His journey began in an era when immigrant neighborhoods functioned as worlds unto themselves, self-reliant, tightly bonded, and often wary of outside authority. It ended in a time when federal institutions possessed the tools, coordination, and legal framework to penetrate even the most insulated criminal enterprises. In that span, the balance between secrecy and accountability shifted decisively. D'Ambrosio's life arc mirrors the broader trajectory of organized crime in the United States. In the early 20th century, illicit networks thrived in part because they filled gaps, economic gaps, cultural gaps, and institutional gaps. Prohibition accelerated their growth, transforming local rackets into structured organizations with national coordination. The mafia families of New York refined hierarchies, codified internal rules, and established mechanisms for dispute resolution. For decades, those systems proved durable. They adapted to changing markets, diversified revenue streams, and emphasized discipline as protection against exposure. The Genovese crime family, with which D'Ambrosio was long associated, became emblematic of that disciplined approach. It avoided unnecessary public displays, prioritized insulation of leadership, and cultivated patience. While rival families sometimes attracted headlines through internal conflicts or flamboyant figures, the Genovese organization often remained comparatively subdued. That culture of caution allowed members like D'Ambrosio to operate for years without the kind of notoriety that might have drawn earlier intervention. But the same patience that sustained the organization also created a long paper trail, patterns of activity that federal investigators would eventually assemble into comprehensive cases. The development and application of RICO statutes marked a turning point not only in law enforcement, but in the philosophy of prosecution. No longer confined to proving isolated incidents, prosecutors could argue that an entire network functioned as an ongoing criminal enterprise. That conceptual shift eroded the protective layers that had once shielded senior members. When D'Ambrosio was convicted in 1996, it was not the dramatic fall of a public celebrity. It was the methodical conclusion of years of investigation, courtroom argument, and judicial process. His sentencing reflected a justice system that had evolved in response to organized crime's endurance. The message was clear. Longevity within a criminal hierarchy would not guarantee immunity from accountability. His imprisonment in advanced age underscored the determination of federal authorities to pursue cases to their conclusion, regardless of a defendant's status or years of service within an organization. Yet Part 8 of his story is not solely about prosecution. It is also about reflection, about what changes and what persists. Organized crime did not vanish with the convictions of the 1980s and 1990s. It adapted, shifting into less visible forms and exploring new avenues shaped by globalization and technology. But the centralized dominance once exercised by the five families was diminished. Oversight in industries like construction and labor increased. Public awareness grew. The aura of untouchability faded. D'Ambrosio's life also invites a more personal reckoning. Born to immigrant parents navigating hardship, he matured in an environment where informal systems of authority often substituted for formal trust in institutions. Many from similar beginnings chose paths that led into civic leadership, business, or public service. He chose another route, one that offered belonging and advancement within a parallel structure operating outside the law. That decision defined his adulthood and ultimately determined his fate. In examining his story, it is important to resist both sensationalism and simplification. Organized crime's history is neither a tale of glamour nor a single narrative of villainy. It is a complex interplay of social conditions, economic incentives, cultural codes, and institutional response. D'Ambrosio was part of that interplay. His rise reflected opportunity within a shadow economy. His fall reflected the strengthening of legal institutions determined to dismantle it. By the time of his death in 2002, the New York of his childhood had been transformed. Italian Harlem had changed demographically and economically. The docks and construction sites that once formed the backbone of racketeering cases operated under tighter scrutiny. Digital records replaced many of the informal systems that once left little trace. The 20th century that had shaped his identity had given way to a new era defined by transparency and rapid information exchange. And yet, certain themes endure. The tension between loyalty and legality, between community allegiance and civic responsibility, remains relevant in many contexts beyond organized crime. D'Ambrosio's adherence to a code of silence and discipline sustained him within his chosen world for decades. But those same qualities, when measured against federal statutes and public accountability, could not shield him from consequence. His life demonstrates that parallel systems of power, however resilient, exist within the larger framework of the state. In the end, Salvatore D'Ambrosio's story is less about spectacle than about structure. He was not the most publicly visible figure of his era, nor the most frequently cited in popular retellings. Instead, he represents the enduring core of an organization that prized continuity and caution. His decades-long presence within the Genovese family provided stability in times of upheaval. His conviction marked the culmination of a sustained effort to confront that stability with legal force. The documentary of his life, taken as a whole, traces a path from the immigrant tenements of 1911 to the federal courtrooms of the 1990s. It passes through Prohibition's unintended consequences, the consolidation of the five families, the televised hearings of the mid-century, and the sweeping RICO prosecutions that redefined accountability. It ends with an aging man whose life encapsulated the rise and retrenchment of traditional mafia power in America. History ultimately judges not only individuals but systems. Salvatore D'Ambrosio lived within a system that promised loyalty, identity, and advancement. For many years, it delivered those rewards, but history also records how that system was challenged, exposed, and constrained by evolving law and public will. His life stands as a testament to both the durability of organized crime in the 20th century and the capacity of institutions to adapt in response. As the credits roll on his story, what remains is a portrait of an era now largely past, a time when influence was negotiated in back rooms, when hierarchy was enforced through tradition, and when silence was considered strength. Salvatore D'Ambrosio carried those principles from youth to old age. In the end, however, it was not silence but documentation, not insulation but exposure, that defined his legacy. In the years since Salvatore D'Ambrosio's death, the world he once navigated has continued to evolve, and with that evolution has come a deeper reassessment of figures like him. Part 9 of his story is not about new events in his life, but about the long shadow his era cast over law enforcement, public policy, and cultural memory. It is about how the rise and fall of men like D'Ambrosio reshaped institutions, and how those institutions, in turn, reshaped the underworld he once called home. By the early 2000s, federal and state authorities had accumulated decades of experience dismantling hierarchical criminal enterprises. The prosecutions that culminated in D'Ambrosio's 1996 conviction were not isolated victories. They were part of a sustained campaign that redefined investigative standards. Multi-agency task forces became the norm. Financial forensics grew more sophisticated. Electronic surveillance, once rare and cumbersome, became central to building enterprise cases. The legal precedents established in RICO trials during the 1980s and 1990s provided prosecutors with a tested blueprint for confronting organized crime in the 21st century. For the Genovese crime family, the post-D'Ambrosio years demanded recalibration. The organization's historic strength, its culture of caution, remained intact, but its operational environment had changed irreversibly. Informants posed a constant threat. Sentencing guidelines offered strong incentives for cooperation. Financial transactions left digital footprints. Where D'Ambrosio's generation relied on face-to-face meetings and coded language, later generations faced a world where a single recorded conversation could reverberate in courtrooms for years. Scholars examining organized crime's trajectory have often divided its history into phases: emergence, consolidation, confrontation, and adaptation. D'Ambrosio's life touched each of these stages. He emerged from an immigrant community navigating marginalization. He consolidated power within a disciplined family structure. He confronted a justice system that evolved to target entire enterprises. And in his final years, he witnessed the beginning of organized crime's adaptation to a surveillance-driven era. Culturally, the public's understanding of mafia history also matured. Earlier portrayals sometimes leaned toward myth, emphasizing codes of honor or dramatized rivalries. Over time, a more nuanced narrative emerged, one grounded in court transcripts, investigative reporting, and academic research. This reframing emphasized the economic consequences of racketeering and the distortion of legitimate markets. Within that context, D'Ambrosio's story is less about intrigue and more about institutional impact. How sustained criminal enterprises can influence industries, and how sustained legal effort can curtail that influence. Part 9 also invites reflection on generational change. The men who came of age in the Prohibition era operated in neighborhoods defined by physical proximity and ethnic cohesion. Their networks were rooted in geography. By contrast, 21st-century criminal enterprises often function across borders, leveraging technology and global finance. The mafia families of New York still exist, but their dominance has been tempered by competition from decentralized and transnational groups. The environment that once allowed a figure like D'Ambrosio to build decades-long influence within a single city has fragmented. Yet his life continues to serve as a reference point in discussions about the durability of organized hierarchies. Law enforcement training programs frequently examine historical cases to understand how criminal enterprises evolve and how investigative strategies must evolve alongside them. The prosecutions that reached D'Ambrosio in his 80s demonstrated that time does not erase enterprise liability. That lesson continues to inform how authorities approach long-term investigations today. There is also a human dimension that remains relevant. D'Ambrosio's path underscores the interplay between environment and decision-making. He grew up in a community marked by limited access to mainstream opportunity and strong internal bonds. Organized crime offered structure and advancement within that environment. But as decades passed, broader society expanded avenues for integration and success. Educational access increased. Economic mobility widened. The contrast between those expanding opportunities and the narrowing space for organized crime became more pronounced. His convictions symbolized that narrowing space. Family members and descendants of organized crime figures often grapple with complex legacies, balancing private memory against public record. While D'Ambrosio himself left no widely known personal memoir, the documentary record ensures that his role within the Genovese family remains part of the historical archive. Court documents, sentencing transcripts, and investigative summaries form a mosaic that historians piece together to understand how such organizations functioned internally and interacted with legitimate institutions externally. In assessing his impact, it is important to emphasize that the decline of traditional mafia power was not the result of a single case or individual conviction. It was cumulative. Each investigation built on previous knowledge. Each informant's testimony clarified structure. Each conviction reinforced the credibility of enterprise prosecution. D'Ambrosio's case was one thread in that broader fabric, significant not because it stood alone, but because it reinforced the pattern. As modern audiences revisit the 20th century through documentaries and archival research, figures like D'Ambrosio provide continuity. They remind us that organized crime was not sustained solely by charismatic leaders, but by disciplined participants who upheld internal codes over decades. The stability of the Genovese family depended on such individuals. Its vulnerability, ultimately, depended on the documentation of their collective actions. Part 9, then, is about legacy in motion. It is about how the arc of one life intersects with institutional reform. It is about how immigrant hardship, urban growth, legislative innovation, and prosecutorial persistence converge in a single narrative. Salvatore D'Ambrosio did not live to see the full digital transformation of law enforcement or the globalization of criminal networks, but the legal precedents shaped during his lifetime continue to influence those developments. In the end, his story reinforces a broader historical lesson. Systems built on secrecy can endure for generations, but they remain subject to the steady accumulation of evidence and the evolving reach of the law. D'Ambrosio's life traced the ascent of one such system and bore witness to its contraction. His legacy endures not in myth, but in the documented transformation of American justice and the reshaping of organized crime in its wake. As this story reaches its final chapter, the life of Salvatore D'Ambrosio can be seen not as an isolated biography, but as a lens through which to understand a century of American change. From the immigrant enclaves of early 20th century New York to the federal courtrooms of the 1990s, his journey traces the arc of organized crime's rise, entrenchment, and gradual unraveling under sustained legal pressure. Part 10 is not about new revelations, but about perspective, about what remains when the headlines fade and the era itself recedes into history. When D'Ambrosio was born in 1911, America was still absorbing the largest wave of immigration in its history. Urban neighborhoods functioned as cultural strongholds where language, religion, and tradition bound families together. Formal institutions often felt distant, and opportunity could seem unevenly distributed. In that landscape, informal networks, some legitimate, some not, offered assistance, protection, and economic pathways. Organized crime grew in those spaces, not in isolation from society, but interwoven with it. Prohibition accelerated that growth, transforming small operations into coordinated enterprises. The mafia families of New York adopted corporate-like hierarchies and governance structures. The Genovese family, disciplined and patient, became known for avoiding unnecessary exposure. Within that framework, D'Ambrosio advanced not by spectacle but by steadiness. His rise reflected the organization's values: loyalty, discretion, and insulation from direct scrutiny. For decades, that model appeared resilient. Law enforcement efforts were often reactive, constrained by jurisdictional limits and narrower statutes. Public fascination sometimes blurred the line between notoriety and myth, but history rarely stands still. Legislative innovation, particularly the development and use of RICO, shifted the balance. Enterprise-level prosecution reframed organized crime as a coordinated system rather than a series of disconnected acts. The very structure that once protected leaders became the blueprint prosecutors used to hold them accountable. D'Ambrosio's conviction in 1996 symbolized that turning point. It was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was procedural, documented, methodical. Evidence was presented, arguments were weighed, and a verdict was rendered. The process reflected a justice system strengthened by decades of experience confronting entrenched networks. His subsequent imprisonment underscored the principle that longevity within a criminal hierarchy did not place one beyond reach. By the time of his death in 2002, the New York he had known as a young man had transformed beyond recognition. The tenement blocks of Italian Harlem had changed demographically and economically. Construction and labor sectors operated under tighter regulatory frameworks. Digital records replaced many informal systems that once left little trace. Organized crime still existed, but its dominance was reduced. Its methods adapted to a world of constant surveillance and financial transparency. Looking back, D'Ambrosio's life invites neither glorification nor oversimplification. It is a study in how environment and individual choice intersect. He emerged from a community that valued resilience and loyalty, yet many from that same environment chose lawful paths that led to lasting civic and economic contributions. His decisions placed him within a parallel structure that promised advancement outside formal channels. For a time, that structure provided stability and influence. Ultimately, it also delivered accountability. Part 10 also asks a broader question. What does it mean when an era ends? The generation that rose during Prohibition and consolidated power in mid-century New York operated under assumptions shaped by limited oversight and strong internal codes. The late 20th century dismantled many of those assumptions. As figures like D'Ambrosio passed from the scene, they took with them the lived memory of a time when organized crime wielded influence with relative confidence. What remained was the record, court transcripts, investigative files, and the historical analysis that followed. Today, when scholars and documentarians revisit that period, they do so with a clearer understanding of its complexity. Organized crime thrived not only because of internal discipline, but because of social conditions that allowed it to root itself in certain industries and neighborhoods. Its decline was not the result of a single hero or moment, but of sustained institutional effort, legislative evolution, and changing public expectations. D'Ambrosio's life encapsulates that continuum. There is a quiet symmetry in the fact that his story begins and ends in New York. The city that shaped him also transformed around him. Its skyline grew taller, its industries modernized, and its institutions strengthened. The shadows that once concealed parallel systems of authority became harder to maintain under the light of coordinated enforcement. His life, spanning 91 years, mirrored that transformation. In closing, Salvatore D'Ambrosio stands as a representative figure of a disciplined, enduring, and ultimately vulnerable system. He was not its most visible leader, nor its most celebrated personality. Instead, he embodied the steady continuity that allowed the Genovese crime family to persist across generations. His conviction and final years demonstrated that even the most insulated structures can be penetrated when law, technology, and public will align. The documentary of his life, taken in full, is not a tale of spectacle. It is a chronicle of structure and change, of how power is built quietly, how it is maintained through loyalty and caution, and how it is challenged through persistence and reform. From the crowded streets of 1911 Manhattan to the institutional corridors of federal court nearly a century later, his story traces the arc of organized crime in America. And when the narrative concludes, what remains is not myth but record, not legend but lesson. Salvatore D'Ambrosio's life reminds us that history is shaped as much by steady participants as by headline figures, and that no system, however disciplined or deeply rooted, exists beyond the reach of time and accountability. In the final reflection on Salvatore D'Ambrosio's life, what emerges most clearly is not a single dramatic turning point, but the steady accumulation of choices set against the steady evolution of institutions. Part 11 is about that long view, the distance that history provides when the personalities have faded and only patterns remain. By the time D'Ambrosio died in 2002, he had lived through nearly every defining chapter of modern American urban history. He was born before the First World War, came of age during Prohibition, navigated adulthood through the Great Depression and the Second World War, witnessed the televised crime hearings of the 1950s, and ultimately faced conviction in the era of enterprise prosecution. Few lives spanned such a complete arc of organized crime's ascent and retrenchment. In his early years, organized crime in New York thrived in part because it adapted faster than the institutions confronting it. It professionalized. It structured itself. It codified rules and established internal governance mechanisms that reduced internal conflict. The Genovese crime family, in particular, refined the art of insulation, ensuring that orders passed through layers, that leadership remained buffered, and that visibility was minimized. D'Ambrosio's advancement within that culture suggests he understood and embodied those principles. For decades, that insulation worked. Law enforcement efforts were often fragmented, limited by jurisdictional boundaries and narrower statutory tools. Prosecutors could secure convictions for specific offenses, but linking those offenses to a durable enterprise proved difficult. The very hierarchy that defined mafia families allowed responsibility to diffuse downward, making accountability elusive. But institutions evolve. By the late 20th century, legislative reform and investigative coordination altered the terrain. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act did more than create new charges. It created a new framework for understanding organized crime as a system. Federal task forces pooled intelligence. Surveillance technology advanced. Financial analysis exposed patterns that once blended into cash-based anonymity. Enterprise cases, once rare, became central to dismantling entrenched networks. D'Ambrosio's conviction in 1996 was the product of that evolution. It was not simply about specific allegations tied to construction and labor racketeering. It was about demonstrating continuity, about showing how an organization operated across time. His decades-long presence within the Genovese structure became part of that narrative. The qualities that once ensured his survival, patience, loyalty, discretion, could not insulate him from a prosecutorial approach designed precisely to overcome such defenses. Part 11 also examines the broader civic impact of that transformation. The weakening of organized crime's grip on certain industries opened space for regulatory reform and competitive markets. Oversight mechanisms grew stronger. Public tolerance for covert influence diminished. The idea that long-standing criminal hierarchies were untouchable lost credibility. While no society eliminates organized crime entirely, the balance of power in New York shifted significantly by the early 2000s. At the same time, D'Ambrosio's story resists simple moral framing. It is not a fable with exaggerated villains or heroes. It is the biography of a man shaped by his environment, who chose to operate within a parallel system of authority that rewarded loyalty and punished dissent. Many of his contemporaries from similar backgrounds built lives in law, business, education, and public service. He chose differently. That divergence underscores the role of agency within context. His life also highlights the generational nature of organized crime. The stability of families like the Genovese organization depended not only on charismatic leaders, but on steady figures who maintained continuity over decades. D'Ambrosio represented that continuity. He was part of the connective tissue linking Prohibition-era consolidation to late-century prosecution. When he passed away, he represented one of the last living bridges to that formative period. By the 21st century, the five families remained active but altered. Their operations were quieter, their structures more fragmented, their influence less overt. Globalized crime networks and digital technologies reshaped the underworld. The insular, neighborhood-based model that defined D'Ambrosio's rise became harder to sustain in an interconnected world. The culture of silence faced pressure from legal incentives that encouraged cooperation. The tools that once protected hierarchy were gradually neutralized. Part 11, therefore, is about legacy in its most durable form, institutional memory. Law enforcement agencies still study cases from the 1980s and 1990s to understand how enterprise prosecutions succeed. Legal scholars analyze RICO precedents established during that era. Historians trace the transformation of immigrant neighborhoods and the social ecosystems that once allowed organized crime to flourish. Within each of those studies, figures like D'Ambrosio appear, not as myths, but as data points in a larger historical pattern. His story ultimately reinforces a fundamental principle. Power built outside the law can endure for years, even generations, but it remains vulnerable to systematic reform. The process may be slow. It may require legislative change, coordinated effort, and cultural shifts, but it is cumulative. D'Ambrosio lived long enough to see that accumulation reach him personally. In the quiet after his passing, there were no sweeping public ceremonies, no cinematic finales. Instead, there was record, archived indictments, sentencing transcripts, investigative summaries. Those records form the enduring testament of his life. They situate him within a century-long dialogue between organized crime and the American justice system. As this narrative closes, Salvatore D'Ambrosio stands not as a symbol of glamour or infamy, but as a figure through whom we can observe transformation. His life began in the shadowed tenements of a growing city and ended in a nation that had recalibrated its response to the structures he once served. The arc of that journey tells a broader story about America itself, about immigration and adaptation, about secrecy and exposure, about endurance and accountability. History does not forget such arcs. It absorbs them, studies them, and learns from them. And in that long view, the life of Salvatore D'Ambrosio becomes part of a larger lesson, that systems, no matter how disciplined or deeply rooted, exist within a framework that evolves, and that over time, the rule of law reshapes the landscape in which they operate. The final chapter of Salvatore D'Ambrosio's story extends far beyond the moment of his passing, resting instead in the tangible spaces where he lived, worked, and eventually died. To understand the full weight of his life, one must walk through the streets of the neighborhoods that shaped him and recognize how they have changed under the hands of time and redevelopment. East Harlem, once a dense cluster of brownstone tenements packed with Italian immigrants speaking a dialect distinct from the standard English of Wall Street, has undergone profound transformations in the 50 years since D'Ambrosio began his career. The row houses that had housed 3 or 4 generations of the same families are now often renovated lofts or divided apartments. The corner stores that served as informal hubs for information exchange have become chain boutiques, cafes, or offices. Yet the geography of power remains, even if the architecture of the underworld has vanished. In many ways, the physical environment serves as the most honest witness to this history. The streets where young men once stood on corners waiting for assignments are now wide avenues with heavy traffic and pedestrian crossings mandated by safety regulations. The factories that employed thousands, then employed none, then became artist studios, tell their own story of industrial decline and urban reinvention. D'Ambrosio's world existed in a specific temporal pocket of the city, a space bounded by prohibition laws, World War mobilizations, and the Cold War era's geopolitical anxieties. As those eras faded, the physical markers of organized crime also receded. Gang signs painted on walls were scrubbed away. Backroom operations moved underground again, or they migrated entirely to cyberspace, leaving behind fewer physical footprints than the cash-heavy operations of the 20th century. The legacy of figures like D'Ambrosio is preserved largely in paper records rather than in monuments or plaques. Federal court files, sealed for decades but slowly unsealed through Freedom of Information requests, sit on shelves in Washington and in district courts across New York. These documents contain the names, dates, and allegations that form the skeleton of a biography. They are dry, technical, and often difficult to read, stripped of the human drama that made them matter in the moment they were written. Yet they represent the institutional memory of the United States government, a ledger of attempts to control and dismantle what were seen as threats to the economic and political order. For historians, these records are invaluable, providing data points that allow researchers to map the movement of funds, the flow of influence, and the structure of authority that once held sway in New York City. Public memory operates differently. It tends to rely on mythos, often fueled by popular culture, film, and television. While D'Ambrosio did not achieve the level of fame that figures like Lucky Luciano or Al Capone enjoyed, his existence contributes to the broader cultural understanding of the mafia experience. He represents the rank-and-file soldier, the man who kept the machinery running when cameras were off and press attention was elsewhere. In museums and local history societies, exhibitions occasionally touch upon the era, showing photographs of the old neighborhoods, news clippings from the trials, and artifacts recovered from raids. These displays emphasize the cost of organized crime, not just to individuals in prison, but to the communities whose economies were distorted by racketeering and whose political voice was sometimes silenced by coercion. There is also a personal legacy that persists among families who lived through that time. Many residents of East Harlem, descendants of the original Italian-American population, carry stories passed down orally. These stories are not always consistent with official records. Oral history can romanticize or demonize, depending on the source. Some may view D'Ambrosio and men like him as protectors who provided work in times of scarcity. Others may view them as predators who exploited vulnerability. This divergence in perspective highlights the complexity of the era. It was not a black and white moral universe. It was gray, nuanced, and deeply human. Understanding that nuance is essential for a complete historical picture. Legal documents rarely capture the warmth of community bonds or the fear of retaliation, yet both were central to daily life for millions in that region. The legal system that prosecuted D'Ambrosio has also evolved since his conviction. Modern RICO applications are more sophisticated, drawing on digital financial trails rather than wiretaps of phone calls. This shift reflects the changing face of criminal enterprise. Today, money laundering is often global, involving offshore accounts and cryptocurrency. Violence is less common than fraud. The men who fill the role of the D'Ambrosios of today operate in ways that are harder to pin down with traditional statutes designed for the mid-20th century. Yet the principles established during the prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s still hold sway. The idea that an entire organization can be charged as a conspiracy remains a cornerstone of federal anti-crime policy. The case of D'Ambrosio serves as a foundational precedent, illustrating how patience and documentation can overcome structural insulation. Archival research continues to uncover new details about figures like D'Ambrosio, though the pace slows with time. As witnesses age and pass away, the window for direct testimony closes. Interviews with former associates, if they occurred at all, become more difficult to facilitate. This adds urgency to the work of historians who seek to document the history before it is lost forever. Libraries and universities have begun digitizing collections related to organized crime, making materials accessible to researchers who might never travel to New York. This accessibility democratizes knowledge, allowing scholars from around the world to contribute to the understanding of this specific slice of American history. It ensures that the story does not belong solely to journalists or tabloids, but becomes part of the academic canon, subject to peer review and rigorous analysis. The impact of these prosecutions rippled outward to affect legitimate business and labor practices. Construction contracts today include stringent compliance requirements that were unimaginable in the 1970s. Labor unions have undergone significant reforms to prevent corruption, driven partly by the need to distinguish themselves from the organizations that infiltrated them decades earlier. In this sense, D'Ambrosio's conviction contributed to the structural health of certain industries. While the immediate result was personal incarceration, the long-term effect was a reduction in the leverage that organized crime wielded over public works and private development. This outcome validates the legislative intent behind the RICO statute and demonstrates the efficacy of targeting enterprise rather than individual acts. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, the cultural appetite for organized crime narratives shifted as well. Audiences grew tired of the glamour associated with gangster films. Crime dramas increasingly focused on police procedure, white-collar offenses, or international terrorism. The mob boss was no longer a tragic hero, but a bureaucrat of vice, a man bound by rigid rules that ultimately trapped him. This shift in media consumption reflected a broader societal understanding that crime pays a price. The romance of the underworld had faded, leaving behind a stark reality of prisons, broken families, and lost opportunities. D'Ambrosio's life stands as a testament to this transition, from the shadowy days of bootlegging to the bright lights of federal prosecution. For the city of New York itself, the reduction of mafia dominance marked a turning point in its civic identity. No longer defined by rumors of corruption, the city began to project an image of openness and global connectivity. Real estate boomed, tourism expanded, and the economy diversified. The neighborhoods that once hid illicit activity were integrated into the mainstream of urban planning. Parks were restored, schools funded, and public transit improved. This revitalization came with its own challenges, including gentrification and displacement of original residents. However, the stability provided by reduced organized crime influence allowed civic institutions to function with greater confidence. The absence of intimidation meant that politicians could campaign openly, contractors could bid freely, and workers could organize legally without fear of reprisal. Salvatore D'Ambrosio's story remains embedded in the fabric of this history, not as a dominant force anymore, but as a historical marker. His name appears in cross-referenced lists of known associates, serving as a connection point in the genealogy of the Genovese family. It is a reminder that organizations are sustained by many hands, not just one head. The longevity of the Genovese family depended on people like D'Ambrosio, who were willing to follow orders and maintain the low profile necessary for survival. When the pressure applied by the government became too great, even the most disciplined networks fractured. The collective endurance gave way to individual vulnerability. The final years of his life spent in custody highlight the human cost of the justice system's victory. Prison is a place of confinement and isolation, far removed from the bustling streets he once walked. For an elderly man, the routine of incarceration can be particularly difficult. Medical care, social interaction, and purpose are scarce resources. Yet within the prison population, he carried a history that few others shared. He knew the men who came before, the leaders who fell from grace, and the era when the law seemed distant. This knowledge made him a repository of oral history, even if he shared little of it. His silence was a habit formed over decades, reinforced by the code that demanded secrecy even when facing the threat of imprisonment. When the narrative of his life concludes, the question arises: what was the true balance of his actions? Did he cause more harm than good? By the standards of the law, he committed crimes that damaged communities and undermined fairness. By the standards of his loyalty, he protected his family and maintained a bond of trust. History generally judges based on the damage inflicted, measuring impact against the ideals of justice and equity. In that framework, D'Ambrosio's actions resulted in net negative value, contributing to a system built on exploitation rather than contribution. However, acknowledging the human context does not negate the judgment. It simply explains why such systems persisted for so long and why replacing them required decades of effort. Today, visitors to the neighborhoods he inhabited can learn about this history through walking tour and informational plaques. Educational programs in local schools teach students about the evolution of civil rights, labor laws, and anti-racketeering statutes. These educational initiatives ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. Young people understand that the stability they enjoy is not guaranteed, but earned through vigilance and adherence to the law. They see the dangers of parallel power structures that operate outside democratic accountability. The story of D'Ambrosio becomes a teaching tool, illustrating the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries set by society. In the end, Salvatore D'Ambrosio's life illustrates the fragility of informal power when faced with formal institutions. No matter how entrenched a network becomes, it remains vulnerable to the persistence of the state. The convergence of technology, legislation, and political will create a force that outweighed the cohesion of the mafia families. This dynamic continues to shape the relationship between citizens and governments worldwide. The struggle between autonomy and regulation, between shadow economies and open markets, remains ongoing. D'Ambrosio's generation represented the tail end of the old order, the final attempt to maintain influence in a world moving toward transparency and accountability. His legacy is quiet, devoid of statues or streets named in his honor. It exists in the archives, in the sentences handed down by judges, and in the histories written by those who studied the era. He was a participant in a great historical shift, a bridge between the past and the present. While he may not be remembered by the general public, his presence within the criminal justice timeline serves as evidence of the law's capacity to adapt and endure. The systems he helped build and inhabit have changed, and in doing so, have secured a safer environment for future generations. That security, however small, is the true measure of the victory achieved in the courtroom where he stood trial and the prison where he spent his final years. The closing of this final part leaves the reader with a sense of closure. The arc of the narrative moves from birth in a crowded city to death in a controlled facility, traversing a century of change along the way. It captures the essence of the American experience in the 20th century, striving for mobility, struggling against barriers, adapting to new rules, and facing the consequences of choices made under pressure. Salvatore D'Ambrosio was not the architect of this history, but he lived within its tectonic plates. His life serves as a record of the earth shifting beneath the feet of millions. When the dust settles, only the solid foundation of the law remains, holding firm against the currents of the underworld that once threatened to wash it away. In the broad sweep of history, there comes a point when an individual life transitions fully from memory into record. Part 13 of Salvatore D'Ambrosio's story exists in that space, where personal biography becomes archival material, and where the echoes of one man's decisions are absorbed into the larger currents of social change. By this stage, the immediacy of trial transcripts and sentencing headlines has faded. What remains is interpretation. To understand the enduring significance of D'Ambrosio's life, one must consider the concept of institutional resilience. Organized crime in New York did not rise overnight, nor did it collapse with a single prosecution. It endured because it embedded itself within existing structures: labor unions, construction markets, transportation hubs. It adapted to economic cycles, political shifts, and demographic change. D'Ambrosio was one of many steady participants who allowed that endurance. His value to the Genovese family was not in spectacle, but in consistency. Organizations depend on such figures to maintain continuity across decades. Yet institutions on the other side of the equation were evolving as well. The American legal system, particularly at the federal level, underwent its own transformation during the 20th century. Coordination between agencies improved. Prosecutors gained access to stronger conspiracy statutes. Courts refined interpretations of enterprise liability. By the time D'Ambrosio faced conviction in 1996, the machinery of federal prosecution had become a coordinated, data-driven force capable of tracing decades of conduct. Part 13 invites a deeper question. What does accountability mean when it arrives late in life? D'Ambrosio was in his 80s when convicted. Some observers might argue that such late-stage prosecutions serve symbolic purposes as much as practical ones. But symbolism matters in the rule of law. The message conveyed was clear: longevity does not erase responsibility. The passage of time does not nullify systemic harm. Even those who navigated the shadows for decades could be brought into the light of judicial scrutiny. There is also the matter of historical correction. Organized crime flourished in environments where regulatory oversight was weak and community trust in institutions was fragile. Over time, reforms strengthened labor transparency, tightened financial reporting, and enhanced civic accountability. D'Ambrosio's prosecution became part of that corrective process. It signaled that the infiltration of legitimate industries would no longer be tolerated as an inevitable feature of urban life. That signal reverberated beyond New York, influencing how other jurisdictions approached entrenched corruption. The social conditions that once gave rise to mafia families also changed. Assimilation reduced the insularity of immigrant neighborhoods. Economic opportunity broadened. Education became more accessible. As communities integrated more fully into the mainstream of American life, the appeal of parallel power structures diminished. This shift did not eliminate crime, but it weakened the cultural ecosystem that had sustained hierarchical families like the Genovese organization. D'Ambrosio's life spanned that entire transition, from insular enclave to global metropolis. In examining his legacy, historians often return to the theme of discipline. The Genovese family's reputation for restraint distinguished it from other groups. It avoided internal chaos and minimized public confrontation. D'Ambrosio's steady advancement within that environment suggests he embodied those traits. Discipline enabled the organization's survival. Ironically, it also created the long, continuous record that prosecutors eventually assembled into a case. Continuity became evidence. Stability became liability. Part 13 also reflects on the generational handoff that followed his death. Organized crime did not dissolve entirely, it evolved. Younger figures stepped into roles once held by men of D'Ambrosio's era, but they operated in a different landscape. one defined by digital communication, international banking regulations, and expanded surveillance powers. The rules had changed. The margins for error were slimmer. The culture of silence faced unprecedented strain from plea agreement and cooperation incentives. For the broader public, the decline of traditional mafia dominance allowed space for new narratives about New York. The city's identity shifted from one marked by corruption scandals and racketeering trials to one associated with finance, technology, and cultural influence. The skyline that D'Ambrosio saw rise in fragments during his youth became a symbol of global connectivity. Organized crime did not vanish, but it no longer defined the city's character. In classrooms and lecture halls, D'Ambrosio's era is studied as a chapter in the evolution of American criminal law. Law students analyze RICO cases to understand enterprise liability. Sociology students examine the role of immigrant communities in shaping underground economies. Urban historians trace the interplay between development projects and labor oversight. Within those academic discussions, his name may appear in footnotes or case citations, small markers of a life that once intersected with larger forces. There is a certain symmetry in that outcome. D'Ambrosio operated in the shadows, preferring low visibility. In historical memory, he remains understated, a supporting figure in a much larger drama. Yet without such supporting figures, the structure would not have stood for as long as it did. His story demonstrates how ordinary persistence can sustain extraordinary systems, for better or worse. Part 13 ultimately underscores the endurance of the rule of law. Systems built on secrecy may thrive temporarily, but they depend on isolation and control of information. Once transparency expands, through technology, legislation, or civic demand, their vulnerabilities multiply. D'Ambrosio lived long enough to see that shift. The world that protected him in mid-century became the world that prosecuted him by century's end. As this extended chronicle draws toward its final reflections, Salvatore D'Ambrosio stands as a bridge between eras. He represents a generation that believed discipline could outlast scrutiny. He also represents the proof that scrutiny, when sustained and methodical, can reshape entrenched systems. His life is neither legend nor morality play. It is a documented journey through the rise and recalibration of organized crime in America. In the quiet permanence of archives and court records, his name endures, not as a symbol of glamour or infamy, but as a testament to the slow, deliberate process by which institutions adapt. The century that began with immigrant tenements and bootleg liquor ended with enterprise prosecutions and digital evidence. Salvatore D'Ambrosio walked that entire distance, and in doing so, he became part of the historical record of how power is built, challenged, and ultimately constrained by the evolving architecture of law. By the time we arrive at Part 14, the life of Salvatore D'Ambrosio has moved fully from lived experience into historical interpretation. What remains is not action, but meaning, not events, but consequences. His story, stretched across more than 9 decades, becomes less about the individual and more about the enduring tension between underground power and institutional authority. D'Ambrosio's generation believed in structure. The mafia families of New York were not chaotic bands of criminals. They were hierarchies built on order, protocol, and discipline. Advancement required patience. Authority flowed downward. Disputes were mediated internally to avoid exposure. In many ways, these organizations mirrored legitimate institutions, boards, executives, regional managers, except their enterprise existed outside the law. D'Ambrosio thrived within that architecture because he understood its rhythms. He did not seek publicity, he sought stability. That stability lasted longer than many critics expected. Through wars, economic collapses, and social upheaval, the Genovese family remained comparatively intact. Its insulation strategies allowed it to avoid the dramatic implosions that plagued rival organizations. Yet the same discipline that minimized internal chaos could not shield it from systemic change. Law enforcement did not rely on spectacle to dismantle it. It relied on persistence. Surveillance was authorized. Financial records were subpoenaed. Informants were cultivated. Cases were built slowly. By the time D'Ambrosio stood in federal court in the 1990s, the confrontation between organized crime and the justice system had matured into a battle of documentation. The secrecy that once protected the hierarchy became evidence of coordination. Conversations once considered safe became transcripts read aloud in courtrooms. The very mechanisms designed to prevent exposure were turned outward, demonstrating the existence of enterprise. Part 14 compels us to consider the generational psychology of men like D'Ambrosio. Born into immigrant hardship, raised in neighborhoods where loyalty was paramount, he entered adulthood during a period when formal opportunity was unevenly distributed. Organized crime offered structure and advancement when other institutions seemed inaccessible. But as the 20th century progressed, access expanded. Education broadened. Civil rights protections strengthened. Economic mobility became more attainable. The rationale for parallel systems weakened. Yet habits forged in youth are not easily abandoned. Loyalty to the organization remained central to D'Ambrosio's identity. Silence was not merely strategy, it was culture. Even in the face of indictment and conviction, there was no public unraveling, no memoir, no attempt to reshape the narrative. His silence mirrored the code that defined his life. It also ensured that his story would be told primarily through external records rather than personal testimony. In the broader sweep of history, the dismantling of entrenched mafia influence in industries like construction and labor marked a civic turning point. Competitive bidding processes became more transparent. Oversight committees gained authority. Public trust, though never absolute, improved incrementally. The city that once navigated whispers of hidden influence gradually repositioned itself as a global capital of finance and culture. The absence of overt racketeering did not solve every problem, but it shifted the baseline of governance. D'Ambrosio's life illustrates the paradox of endurance. For decades, he succeeded by remaining steady and unobtrusive. Longevity became a marker of competence within the organization. Yet in the end, that same longevity provided prosecutors with a narrative of sustained participation. The long arc that once signaled stability became proof of continuity. In this way, time itself turned against him. Part 14 also reflects on mortality and memory. As the last members of the Prohibition-era generation pass away, living memory of that formative period fades. What remains are archives, photographs, and secondary analysis. Without living witnesses, interpretation grows more important. Historians must piece together motives from actions, reconstruct context from court filings, and separate myth from documentation. D'Ambrosio's reserved public profile makes this task both challenging and essential. There is a temptation in organized crime storytelling to focus on extremes, spectacular violence, dramatic betrayals, cinematic confrontations. But the more instructive reality often lies in routine. Meetings held consistently, payments tracked carefully, orders relayed quietly. D'Ambrosio's role exemplified that routine. He was part of the machinery rather than its most visible face. Understanding such roles is crucial for understanding how the machinery functioned for so long. As institutions strengthened, the narrative shifted from inevitability to accountability. The idea that certain neighborhoods or industries were permanently under criminal influence lost traction. Legal victories, reinforced by public support, demonstrated that entrenched systems could be challenged. D'Ambrosio's conviction became one piece of that broader proof. It showed that even disciplined organizations with decades of insulation were not immune. In reflecting on his life, one sees not only a man shaped by his era, but an era reshaped by the confrontation with men like him. The tension between loyalty and legality, between internal codes and public law, defined much of the 20th century's organized crime saga. By its close, the balance had shifted decisively toward institutional authority. The quiet dominance once exercised in back rooms gave way to oversight hearings and compliance audits. Part 14 thus serves as a meditation on transition. Salvatore D'Ambrosio began life in a city where immigrant communities built parallel support systems to survive exclusion. He ended life in a nation where those systems had been largely absorbed or dismantled by formal institutions. The underworld that once promised permanence proved temporary. The law that once seemed distant proved durable. In the end, his story affirms a broader historical pattern. Systems that depend on secrecy may thrive in silence, but they are vulnerable to exposure. Systems grounded in transparency and rule of law, though imperfect, possess the capacity to adapt and endure. D'Ambrosio's life unfolded in the space between those systems. When the balance tipped, it did so decisively. And so, as this extended narrative approaches its final reflections, Salvatore D'Ambrosio stands as a quiet figure within a loud century, a man who navigated shadows for decades, only to be defined ultimately by the light cast upon them. Part 15 brings this long chronicle to its true conclusion, not with new events, but with final perspective. Salvatore D'Ambrosio's life, when viewed across its full span from 1911 to 2002, becomes less a tale of notoriety and more a study in how eras rise and fall around the individuals who inhabit them. He was born into a New York defined by steamships and tenements, by horse-drawn carts giving way to automobiles, by immigrant enclaves forming protective circles in an unfamiliar land. Opportunity was uneven. Institutions were distant. Informal systems filled the gaps. In that world, organized crime did not present itself as an abstract national threat. It presented itself as structure, predictable, loyal, and close at hand. For a young man in Italian Harlem, the path toward the Genovese family was not a leap into spectacle. It was a step into an existing framework of influence. Across the decades, D'Ambrosio witnessed the maturation of that framework. Prohibition expanded it. The Depression tested it. Post-war prosperity diversified it. The Commission formalized it. And through it all, discipline preserved it. The Genovese crime family became known not for flamboyance, but for patience. Its power rested not in headlines, but in continuity. D'Ambrosio's role was emblematic of that continuity, steady, methodical, restrained. For much of the 20th century, that model proved resilient. But resilience is not permanence. The institutions tasked with confronting organized crime were learning, refining, and strengthening. Federal statutes evolved. Interagency cooperation expanded. Surveillance technology advanced. Financial records became traceable. Informants reshaped the evidentiary landscape. The balance that once favored insulation began to tilt toward exposure. When D'Ambrosio was convicted in 1996, it marked more than the sentencing of an elderly man. It represented the culmination of a long institutional campaign against systemic criminal enterprise. His conviction symbolized the idea that no hierarchy, however disciplined, exists beyond the reach of law when that law adapts and persists. The decades that had once shielded him became part of the proof against him. In prison, removed from the networks that had defined his adult life, he lived out his final years as the 20th century closed. By the time he died in 2002, the world outside had transformed. The neighborhoods of his youth were no longer insular Italian enclaves. The industries once vulnerable to racketeering operated under expanded oversight. The mythic aura of mafia invincibility had faded under the weight of enterprise prosecutions. And yet history rarely deals in absolutes. Organized crime did not vanish. It changed. It decentralized. It adapted to globalization and technology. But the centralized dominance of the old five families, built on territorial control and hierarchical silence, had been fundamentally weakened. D'Ambrosio's life spanned both the height of that dominance and the beginning of its contraction. What endures most powerfully is the structural lesson. Systems built on secrecy rely on controlled information and rigid loyalty. They can endure for decades if left unchallenged. But systems built on transparency, documentation, and institutional memory possess a different kind of endurance. They may move more slowly, but they accumulate strength over time. The story of Salvatore D'Ambrosio is, in many ways, the story of that accumulation. There is no monument to him in New York. No plaque marks the street corners where he once stood. His name survives primarily in legal records, investigative archives, and historical analyses. But in those records, his life performs an important function. It illustrates how organized crime operated beneath the surface of legitimate commerce. It demonstrates how enterprise statutes dismantled structures that once seemed immovable. And it affirms that accountability, though delayed, can arrive even after decades of insulation. His story also reflects the complexity of human choice. Born into hardship, shaped by community loyalty, he chose a path that offered belonging and advancement within a shadow system. Others from similar beginnings chose differently. That divergence underscores a central truth. Environment influences, but it does not determine. Individual decisions shape trajectories. Over time, those trajectories intersect with evolving institutions that either reinforce or challenge them. As this final part closes, the narrative of Salvatore D'Ambrosio resolves into its simplest form. A boy of immigrants grew into a disciplined participant in one of America's most enduring crime families. He advanced quietly. He survived upheaval. He faced prosecution late in life. He died having witnessed the transformation of both his organization and his city. His arc parallels the arc of 20th century organized crime emergence, consolidation, confrontation, and recalibration. The tension that framed his birth, the collision between opportunity and exclusion, lingered throughout his life. But by its end, another tension had been resolved: the contest between entrenched secrecy and institutional reform. The reform prevailed not through spectacle but through persistence. Salvatore D'Ambrosio does not stand as a legend. He stands as a record of how power can be accumulated quietly, a record of how it can endure through discipline, and a record of how, in the long sweep of history, it can be constrained by a system determined to uphold the rule of law. With that, his story, spanning nearly a century, finds its close. Part 16 serves as the epilogue, not to extend the chronology further, but to draw the widest possible lens around the life of Salvatore D'Ambrosio and the century that carried him from obscurity to indictment, from neighborhood loyalty to federal accountability. If one were to stand today in East Harlem and look north toward the Bronx, it would be difficult to imagine the layered networks that once operated quietly in those same streets. Traffic hums, storefronts change hands, generations move in and out. The visible city renews itself constantly. Yet beneath that renewal lies the sediment of history, stories of migration, survival, ambition, and in some cases, organized crime. D'Ambrosio's life was embedded in that sediment. He was not the loudest figure in it, but he was one of its steady currents. His generation believed in permanence. The structure of the mafia family was designed to endure beyond any one individual. Leadership could change, circumstances could shift, but the hierarchy boss, underboss, caporgime, soldier was intended to be timeless. Ritual reinforced loyalty, silence reinforced survival, patience reinforced stability. For decades, this design functioned exactly as intended. But permanence is an illusion in a society governed by evolving law. What the architects of organized crime could not fully anticipate was the persistence of institutional reform, the slow development of conspiracy statutes, the refinement of wiretap authorization, the integration of financial oversight, the willingness of insiders to cooperate under reduced sentences. These were not sudden revolutions, they were incremental adjustments. And incrementally, they eroded the protections that hierarchy once provided. D'Ambrosio's conviction late in life encapsulated that erosion. It was not driven by emotion or spectacle. It was driven by record, by transcripts, financial trails, and the accumulated weight of enterprise theory. The The same steadiness that defined his role within the Genovese family defined the government's pursuit of him: methodical, patient, structured. There is an irony in that symmetry. Two systems, one operating in secrecy, one in statute, both built on order and discipline. For decades, they coexisted uneasily. Eventually, one prevailed because it possessed adaptability anchored in public mandate. Organized crime could evolve tactically, but it could not rewrite the laws that expanded around it. The state, by contrast, could refine its tools in response to emerging threats. Part 16 also invites reflection on memory itself. The mythic era of organized crime has largely passed from living memory into curated narrative. Museums, documentaries, court archives, and academic research now serve as the primary custodians of that history. D'Ambrosio appears in those sources not as a celebrity, but as a connective figure, evidence of how sustained participation, rather than dramatic leadership, allowed the Genovese family to function over generations. His story challenges the tendency to focus only on charismatic figures at the top. It reminds us that institutions, licit or illicit, depend on consistent actors who maintain continuity. Without men like D'Ambrosio, the hierarchical model of the five families could not have endured. And without the cumulative documentation of those same men, prosecutors could not have demonstrated the enterprise's scope. The broader American narrative into which his life fits is one of institutional strengthening. The 20th century saw the rise of federal regulatory agencies, the professionalization of policing, the expansion of prosecutorial coordination, and the digitization of financial systems. Each development narrowed the operational space available to traditional organized crime. While new forms of criminal enterprise emerged, cybercrime, transnational fraud, the territorial, union-influencing mafia model lost ground. D'Ambrosio did not live to see the full digital transformation of society, but he lived long enough to see the foundations laid. He saw surveillance shift from physical tails to electronic interception. He saw prosecutions shift from isolated charges to enterprise-wide indictments. He saw the aura of untouchability diminish. And in the final accounting, that is the central lesson of his life. Power maintained through secrecy may feel permanent to those within it, but permanence belongs to systems that are transparent, accountable, and capable of reform. His generation built a disciplined underworld that shaped mid-century New York. The institutions that followed reshaped it in return. Salvatore D'Ambrosio's name will likely never occupy a central place in popular culture. It survives instead in footnotes, in legal citations, in the meticulous records of prosecutors and defense attorneys. Yet those records tell a story that stretches far beyond one man. They tell of a city evolving, of immigrant communities integrating, of law adapting, of structures built and dismantled. In closing this final part, we return to the image of New York at the dawn of the 20th century, a city of steam and stone, of ambition and uncertainty. Into that city, a child was born who would spend his life navigating its hidden hierarchies. 91 years later, he left behind not legend but documentation, not myth but measured consequence. His life is a reminder that history is not shaped only by those who stand at podiums or in headlines. It is also shaped by those who operate quietly within systems, sustaining them, testing them, and ultimately being tested by them in return. And when the testing is complete, when the eras have shifted and the structures have changed, what remains is the enduring framework of law, still standing, still evolving, long after the shadows that once moved beneath it have faded. Part 17 moves beyond the chronology of a single life to examine the silence that follows the final verdict. With Salvatore D'Ambrosio gone and the era he represented receding into the distance, the story shifts from narrative to legacy, not in the sense of what he left behind for his family or organization, but in what his life signifies for the historical record of American justice. In the quiet of archives and the stillness of sealed files, the true weight of his existence settles. There are no statues erected in his honor, no streets renamed to mark his passage. The physical world of New York has scrubbed away the visible markers of his time. The corner stores where messages were exchanged have been replaced by glass-fronted cafes. The warehouses that once hid illicit cargo now house legitimate logistics firms or have been converted into residential lofts. The city has moved on, its rhythm accelerated by technology and globalization, leaving the slow, deliberate pace of the mid-century underworld as a distant memory. Yet, in this erasure of the physical, the documentary record gains prominence. The transcripts of his trial, the affidavits of investigators, and the sentencing memoranda stand as the only enduring monuments to his life. They are dry, technical documents, devoid of drama, yet they contain the essential truth of his trajectory. A lifetime of calculated risk met by a system of patient accountability. This part of the story forces a confrontation with the nature of historical truth. Popular culture often prefers the myth of the mobster, the charismatic leader, the tragic hero, the man of honor among thieves. D'Ambrosio fits none of these archetypes. He was a functionary of a criminal enterprise, a man whose power derived not from personality but from position within a rigid hierarchy. His significance lies precisely in his ordinariness within that extraordinary context. He represents the vast majority of organized crime participants who never made headlines, who never ordered hits, but who kept the machinery running through decades of quiet complicity. Understanding history requires acknowledging these figures, for without them, the organizations could not have sustained their influence over labor, construction, and commerce for so long. The legacy of D'Ambrosio is also a testament to the evolution of the rule of law. His conviction was not a singular event, but the culmination of a generational struggle between the state and the underworld. It marked the point where the legal system finally caught up with the complexity of organized crime. For decades, the mafia had operated with a level of sophistication that outpaced law enforcement's ability to prosecute it as a unified entity. The development of RICO and the strategic use of informants changed the game. D'Ambrosio's prosecution demonstrated that the law could pierce the veil of insulation that senior figures had relied upon for protection. It proved that loyalty codes could be broken by the reality of federal sentencing guidelines, and that the passage of time did not grant immunity. Furthermore, his life offers a sobering reflection on the cost of such choices. While the public narrative often focuses on the wealth and power accumulated by mob figures, the personal toll is frequently overlooked. A life lived in the shadows requires constant vigilance, a suppression of trust, and an acceptance of isolation. For D'Ambrosio, the final years spent in federal custody were a stark contrast to the autonomy he once exercised. The decline of his physical health, the separation from community, and the reduction of his identity to an inmate number serve as a grim counterpoint to the allure of the criminal lifestyle. It underscores the ultimate futility of building a legacy on foundations that the state is determined to dismantle. As we look back from the vantage point of the present day, the world that shaped D'Ambrosio seems almost alien. The ethnic enclaves that provided the recruitment pool for the 5 families have largely dissolved into the broader melting pot of American society. The economic desperation that drove young men into the arms of organized crime has been mitigated, though not eliminated, by social safety nets and expanded educational opportunities. The corruption that allowed racketeers to infiltrate unions and city agencies has been checked by stricter regulations and oversight bodies. The environment that nurtured a figure like D'Ambrosio no longer exists in the same form. This transformation is perhaps his most significant indirect contribution to history. His downfall, and the downfall of his peers, helped clear the way for a more transparent and accountable civic order. Yet the story does not end with a simple triumph of good over evil. Organized crime has not vanished, it has mutated. The hierarchical, territory-based model of the Genovese family has given way to decentralized, transnational networks that operate in the digital realm. The challenges facing law enforcement today are different, involving cryptocurrency, cyber fraud, and global supply chains. However, the principles established during the prosecutions of the late 20th century remain relevant. The idea that criminal enterprises can be targeted as whole entities, that patterns of behavior constitute evidence, and that no one is above the law. These are the enduring legacies of the battles fought by men like D'Ambrosio and the prosecutors who pursued them. In the final analysis, Salvatore D'Ambrosio is a figure of historical gravity. He anchors a specific moment in time when the balance of power in New York City shifted irrevocably. He represents the end of an era where the mafia could operate as a parallel government within the city limits. His life serves as a case study in the limits of informal power when confronted with the relentless, adaptive force of formal institutions. He was a man who believed in the permanence of his organization, only to find that the only permanent thing was the law itself. As the dust settles on this extended narrative, the image that remains is not of a kingpin ruling from a throne, but of an old man sitting in a courtroom, listening to the reading of charges that span decades of his life. It is an image of accountability delayed but not denied. It is a reminder that history has a long memory, and that the structures we build, whether of brick or of silence, are subject to the erosion of time and the scrutiny of justice. D'Ambrosio's story is complete, not because he died, but because the chapter he inhabited has closed, leaving behind a record that warns future generations of the seductive danger of power without legitimacy.